Good morning. This is Action News Jax Sunday.
Good morning. It's Sunday, May 19th, 2019. Welcome to Action News Jax Sunday. I'm Paige Kelton. A local neurologist is suing Carnival Cruise Lines for using property stolen from his family in Cuba nearly 60 years ago. In an exclusive interview, he tells Action News Jax' Lorena Inclán why now, for the first time, he's able to hold Carnival accountable in a U.S. court.
1920s Santiago de Cuba, the home of La Marítima Parreño, a booming port founded by Javier Garcia Bengochea's family.
Really turned what was a muddy riverbank into a first world enterprise.
But the business took a devastating blow in 1960 when armed men barged into the port's offices and demanded that everyone get out.
They were stealing the business.
They was Fidel Castro's communist revolution, which led to a nationalization of private businesses, even those owned by Cuban citizens. The owners of the confiscated properties have been waiting decades for a chance to sue for the illegal use of their lands. On May 2nd, this Jacksonville neurosurgeon got his chance. It comes after a historic decision by President Trump to fully enact Title III of the Helms-Burton Act. It allows U.S. and naturalized Cuban nationals to sue companies that exploit the seized property on the island. One of the companies Garcia alleges is doing just that is Carnival Cruise Lines. This Google map shows a time lapse of Garcia's port. Cruise liners didn't start showing up until 2015, which is after President Obama began trying to ease relations.
At last count, there are 11 cruise lines trafficking in my stolen property.
But many criticize Title III for what's perceived to be its extraterritorial nature. In other words, what jurisdiction can a U.S. court have in Cuba? Garcia says the criticism is misplaced.
Title III faithfully, almost to the letter, reflects the intent of international law that prohibits confiscating property, that prohibits expropriation without fair and prompt compensation.
Garcia holds a certified claim that was issued to his cousin by the federal government. For him, justice is long overdue.
I guess as a neurosurgeon, I'm more of a fixer than a doer. And I simply, I can't just sit back and see the system not work.
And he's not the only one. ExxonMobil is suing two Cuban companies for $280 million over an oil refinery and gas stations it claims were confiscated. JU professor of history Jesse Hinkson says settling these claims is crucial.
It should be the first step before we even talk about ending the embargo. It has to be, in order to reconcile between the United States and Cuba.
Hinkson says the lawsuits could also create tension between the U.S. and allies like Spain and Canada, two of the largest investors in Cuba.
People who may be watching this may be thinking, this seems like an uphill battle, this seems so complicated, why not just move on? What would you tell them?
That's a difficult question to answer, because really I don't know that the answer is very good for them to hear. This is a question of right and wrong.
Garcia tells me he'll let the jury decide on what the damages should be, but morally, he believes he's already won. He only wishes his cousin was alive to see it.
What do you think he would say today?
He kept waiting for this day, and where he could assert his rights. And I think they'd all be very happy.
Lorena Inclán, Action News Jax.
Dr. Garcia tells us travel agents, universities, and civic groups that plan trips to Cuba could also be liable if they knew or should have known that the properties they're flocking to were confiscated. In a statement, a spokesman for Carnival Cruise Line says, "We sought and received formal approval from the U.S. government, OFAC, under the required rules before we ever began sailing to Cuba in 2016. We are continuing our regular schedule of cruises to Cuba under these established guidelines." To give you even more context on this topic, here's more of Lorena's interview with Dr. Garcia Bengochea.
So, Dr. Garcia, I'd love to be able to start, though, with, I know you were really young when you left the island, but if you can tell us a little bit about your family history in the 1950s and specifically your family's business there, and tell us about it. I imagine it was a prosperous business before Fidel Castro came in. Could you tell us a little bit about the history there?
Yes, so this was on my mother's side of the family. After the Cuban War of Independence, which we call here in this country the Spanish-American War, the war really devastated the eastern part of the island where my mother's family was from the Santiago area, and in particular the port and the port facilities. Now you have to understand that an island economy is hugely dependent on the port, on the ability to import and export items, in particular for eastern Cuba, sugar, cattle, minerals. And the problem was the new Cuban government after the War of Independence had no money to improve the infrastructure. And the only real alternative was for an American company, United Fruit Company, to effectively own the port, to rebuild the port. And the Cuban businessmen on the eastern end of the island did not think that was a particularly good idea to have in the hands of a foreign entity effectively the means of commerce. So a relative of mine put together investors, started this business in 1905 and put together investors, and ultimately bought the land around the customs house and got a perpetual concession to the waterfront and rebuilt the port, and really turned what was a muddy riverbank into a first world enterprise. In fact, we had the first refrigerated dock in the Caribbean. So this really was a great asset to building prosperity in the community in Oriente, in our province.
On May 2nd, we saw you at the steps of a federal courthouse in Miami,
Yes.
and there was another gentleman, Mr. Ben, I believe is,
Yes.
I'm saying correctly.
Yes.
He talked about how the ports or the docks in Havana were taken from his family at gunpoint.
Yes.
Do you know the story of that day when the Cuban Revolutionary Army came in and took the port from your family?
I do. As I said, my cousins, two brothers, ran the business. One was in Cuba, was the president of the business, and the other brother was actually a practicing lawyer in New York City on Wall Street. But he was the general manager and really was the one who kind of dotted the I's and crossed the T's in terms of the business. So they knew that, there was going to be this nationalization law, Law 890, which was effectively a fiat confiscating 386 private Cuban businesses. Now, Cubans up to that point had seen the nationalization of big farms, of foreign industries, particularly Americans, and this was obviously very disturbing to them, but no one thought that they would steal the businesses of Cubans. And in fact, most people at the time thought this would bring a true civil war. There was already unrest within the ranks of the Castro dictatorship, but they thought it would bring a civil war. So my cousin was in Havana at the time, where he had an apartment, and he got a call from the administrator who said, you know, they're here, the Marine police, their jeeps, rifles, and they have told us that don't take anything out of the building, that we were excused that day from work. And at any rate, so my cousin decided, he wanted to go back to Santiago and make the case for why the business shouldn't be confiscated, shouldn't be stolen. And he decided instead, you know, they're going to arrest me and justify this by saying that I'm a tax cheat or something to that effect. So he packed a suitcase and went to Miami. That day. He received a letter about a week later detailing exactly what happened. And as I said, the Marine police came with the military and excused everybody that day, told no one, you know, told everyone they could not take anything out of the office. And the next day when the administrator came, he would go pick up the mail first, then he would come to the office. They told him that he was done, he was terminated. And then that was that. And he couldn't take any of his personal belongings or anything out of the office. They were all patrimony, part of the state.
And this is a business that's been in your family since 1905, and just like that, it's over.
Yes.
I did remember something I wanted to ask you. Your cousin, has he passed away?
Yes.
What do you think he would say today?
I think he'd be thrilled. He'd be very pleased. He kept waiting for this day, and where he could assert his rights And I think they'd all be very happy. And I think it is the right thing for the society. This is not an effort by people like me to throw someone's grandmother out into the street. This is to restore the rule of law, law and order in Cuba. The notion that capitalism can even work, much less be transformative, as was the theory, is absolutely ridiculous in a country where everything is stolen, where there's no clear title to property. Without clear title to property and property rights, you can't get credit. You have to have collateral. I mean, this is just the blocking and the tackling of commerce, and the fact that Americans who, on the issue of Cuba, are either incredibly intellectually dishonest or absolutely abandon all critical thinking. It's just remarkable that you could ascribe to this theory in a country where everything is stolen. Even work product. Americans don't notice the significance of the two currencies in Cuba. It is institutional slavery. It is institutional slavery, 100 miles away from Miami, and no one says a thing. And yet you want to take down a monument, you know, in the center of your plaza to a Confederate general. The cognitive dissonance of that is just remarkable to me.
Thank you so much for sharing your story. It is remarkable and unprecedented and historic as well, what's happening.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you.